As you heard, we are in the middle of a series called I Choose. And this is an exciting series where, throughout our entire life, we get to make decisions, right? We're constantly choosing different things, choosing this, choosing that. And last week, we talked about the fact that we are the sum of all the decisions that we make, right? So if you think about that, all the good, all the bad, all the other decisions that you make throughout your life, we are the sum total of all of those decisions. And last week we talked about choosing purpose over popularity, right? And that can sometimes be difficult, right? That's why it's not popular. And we choose purpose over popularity. Next week we're going to be talking about choosing discipline over regret. Now, we're all going to have some regrets in our life, right? I don't think any of us are going to escape life without having a certain amount of regrets. But can we choose to be disciplined so that we can at least minimize those regrets, right? And I think we can if we put things to good practice. Today, I'm excited about our talk. We are going to be talking about choosing surrender over control today. Choosing surrender over control. Now, how many people here today would say that they like to be in charge of at least, or in control of at least some aspect of their life? Does everybody like to be in control of some aspect of their life? Hopefully, right? I would think somebody does. Okay, so most of us like to be in control of some aspects of our life. How many of you, though, like to be in control of all aspects of your life? Like everything from soup to nuts, you have to be in charge of it. You are a control freak. Right? How many of you, anybody going to be brave enough to raise their hand? Come on, I know there's somebody out here. There's a few of you, okay? Right? And so, if you didn't raise your hand, and that person is sitting next to you today, and you know that they should have had their hand up, go ahead and raise their hand. It's okay. We have a marriage series coming up soon, so don't worry. No. Look, I don't generally consider myself to be a control freak. That's not a description I would put on myself. In fact, I'm probably guilty of the opposite end of the spectrum. I tend to hand off more things than I try to control. However, the things that I do try to control are things that typically what's happening when I try to take control, it's because God isn't meeting my timelines, right? He's not working the way I want it done and on my timeline. And so sometimes I feel like I've got to grab it and I've got to take control of it because I can't trust that God's going to handle it for me, right? So I reel it in and I gotta grab a hold of it and take control. Now, some of you, if you've known me for a while, you may know this about me, that for a long time, for several years, I have wanted to start my own church. That's been an ambition of mine. It's been a goal of mine. It's been something that I'm passionate about. Maybe someday this will happen. But about a year and a half ago, my wife and I, we were church hunting, right? Just like you people in here today for the first time, it's never fun, right? It's kind of scary, it's kind of strange, it's kind of awkward, and you're out there looking at different churches, trying to figure out which one's the right one for you, and are you going to fit in? And we were doing that, and we were looking for that right church, that perfect church, right? Does that perfect church actually exist? It does. It's actually right here. No, but we were looking for that perfect church, and so over here we tried like all the different churches in Chanhassen, and we tried all the churches in Chaska, and we looked kind of at every church that was out there, and what we found, it was sort of like the Goldilocks story, if you're familiar with this story, right? So over here it was like the perfect message. It was a great message, but we really didn't like the music. And then over here, wow, the music was great, but really didn't care so much for the message. And maybe there was another one that the music and the message were pretty good, but we weren't really crazy about the kids' ministry, right? And it was sort of like that. As we looked at different churches, we just couldn't find the one that sort of had everything. And so I reached this conclusion in my head that maybe I should just start my own church, right? The thought process was this, that if nobody else can do it right, I guess I'll just do it myself. Does that sound like anybody here today, right? And so if nobody else can do it right, I'll do it myself. And now I hadn't really clearly thought this through. I didn't exactly have like a launch team ready to go rallying behind me saying, go John, let's start a church together. I didn't have a location picked out. I don't really know any musicians to speak of. And, I didn't have a pile of money sitting over here to help me launch the church or, any of these types of things. But I was ready to go, right? And so I started praying and I started thinking through this and my wife was praying and I'm praying and we're hoping that at some point that God would sort of start to draw things together for us and enlighten us a little bit and maybe answer some of the questions for us, like the when, the where, the why, the how, and sort of connect those dots for us. Well, ultimately, that's exactly what God did. Well, sort of what God did. Let me put it that way. He sort of did that. And God, because I'm not God, fortunately for all of you guys, because I'm not God, God has a tendency to handle things different than I handle things. And one of the things that God does is he handles things on his own schedule and his own timeline and with his own method. And so God's answer to my prayers wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but here's sort of how it went down. I went out to the mailbox one day, and there was a direct mail piece in there. And we grabbed the direct mail piece, and I'm showing it to my wife, and it was for this new church that had just started in the area called Turning Point Church. And we thought, well, shoot, we've looked at all the other churches in the area. Should we just look at one more? I guess it wouldn't kill us to try one more church, right? And so about a year and a half ago, we started coming here to this church, and clearly we're still here. You can't get rid of us. And we've been coming, and we obviously enjoy it. But God, because He doesn't just stop there with the obvious. It wasn't just a matter of, well, I should probably help these guys find a church that they can call home. He sort of upped the ante a little bit. And what he allowed me to do with this church is he allowed me to become a pastor as part of this church. And that was very exciting for me. It was a big opportunity. And I get to get up here and do what I love to do, and that's get in front of you great folks and preach and teach and have fun doing this. But God, because he's super cool, and he likes to do really cool things just so that you know that it's God at work and not your own doing. So one of the other things that he allows me to do sometimes is he lets me play up here in the band. Now, I know for a lot of you probably refer to this as the worship team, right? For me, because it's as close as I'm ever going to get to playing in a band, I call it the band, right? I tell people that I'm in a band, right? And when you grow this out, it makes you look like you're in a band, right? All I need is some tattoos and I'm in business. All right, so it's exciting for me to be part of this. But truth be told, here's what I find, guys. If I give it up to God, if I just trust God a little more often than I do, things tend to work out. They tend to work out in my favor. They tend to work out the way they should, because God knows so much more than I do, and he's already got it laid out. And here's the reality of it. When we try to take control of everything, when we think that we have to be in control of everything, it's not just a physical issue, it's not a psychological issue. What it really is, guys, is it's a spiritual issue. It's an issue of the heart, right? It's a lack of trust is really what it is in the God Almighty. And right, so today, what I want to do is we're going to take a look at this passage in the Bible. It's probably one of the most quoted, most popular verses in the Bible. You've probably heard it, and maybe some of you have heard it dozens of times. You've read it, maybe you've memorized it. For some of you, you've never heard it before. You've never seen it in the Bible, and it's your first time you're going to hear it. It doesn't really matter. I don't care. Wherever you fall in that spectrum is good, because here's what I want to ask you to do today. I want to ask you to hear this verse for the first time. I want you to hear this verse as if it's being spoken to you directly from God. And I want you to do one more thing. I want you to ask God to help you live out this verse. Okay, so here it is. Proverbs 3, verse 5 says this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways submit to God, and he will make your paths straight." Go ahead and leave that up here for just a minute or so. I want to talk about this. I kind of want to unpack this a little bit, break this down for us. So what is this verse saying to us? First off, it's saying to us to trust in the Lord with all our heart. Right? What does that mean? Sounds good, but what does it mean, right? To give it up to God with all of our heart, everything that we're made of, everything that we think of, everything that we are, we trust in the Lord. So we don't hold back anything. We surrender completely to God and let him take control. Then we're told that we're to lean on God's understanding. Not on our understanding, on God's understanding. Now, how many of you know that God's understanding is not your understanding? Right? There are things that God knows, that God understands, that God sees, that you don't. Right? He's got much better than 20/20 vision, right? He understands things significantly better than we do. So we're to trust in the Lord and then we're to lean on God's understanding. Now, the next thing we're told is that we are to submit. Submit to God. Well, kind of a strange word. We don't use that word a lot in our daily language, but the original word, if we go back a few thousand years and we look at what the Hebrews were actually writing, when we talk about the word submit, what they actually were writing was to know God, was to acknowledge God. In fact, if we look at the beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, when it refers to Adam and Eve, there's a similar word there, and the word is a sort of an intimate knowing of one another. As Adam knew Eve, it was this intimate knowing, and that's how we're to know God. When we submit to God, we're acknowledging God, we're knowing God, we're trusting in God, we're leaning on God. And that's what we're being told to do in this verse. And here's the cool part. When we do this, what we're told is that He will make our path straight. Not that we make our own path straight, but that He will sort of architect our pathway, right? What better person to lay out our pathway for us than Him, right? So we're to trust in Him, and He'll lay out our pathway for us. Now, let's face it, the more we try to control things, the more we try to hold on to everything and control everything, the more we fear losing control. And the more we fear losing control, what do? We try to control. And it's like this crazy cycle, right? This circle of events, this fear of control, right? And loss of control. And so it goes round and round and round. And in the Bible, we're not the only people that struggle with this. Trust me. So there were people throughout the biblical times that struggle with this. There will probably be people always that struggle with this. But there's a really cool story in the Bible. In the first book of the Bible, Genesis, in the Old Testament, there's a lot of cool stories in there, but one of the cool stories in there deals with this very topic, and this idea of control gone bad. In fact, if I was in charge of writing the Bible, I would have labeled it Control Gone Bad. Nobody asked me, so it didn't get labeled that. It sounds like a cool movie series or something. But this story is about a couple named Sarah and Abraham. And here's what was going on at this time. So Abraham, he had received this blessing from God. And this blessing from God was that he was going to be the father of many nations. Now, Abraham didn't exactly have very many kids, right? And in fact, Abraham didn't have any kids at the time. And so this probably seemed a little odd to Abraham. How am I going to go about fathering many nations when I don't have any kids? I don't have any descendants that are going to help me father these many nations. So I'm sure he was pondering this and thinking through this, and he was a faithful person, and he was relying on God to deliver. But here's what happened. Years went by, and God hadn't fulfilled this promise yet, right? And so here's what Abraham and Sarah decided to do. They decided to do what most of us decide to do. They decided to do what I decide to do, and that is take control in their own hands, right? God wasn't meeting their timeline, so I guess I'll just do it myself, right? God probably forgot about this one. He probably missed this one. And so I'll go ahead and take control myself. That's probably what they were thinking. So here's where we pick up the story in Genesis 16. It says this. Now, Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Remember that name. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and they conceived. Wow. I can already see that's going to go down bad, right? Can you imagine? Can you imagine that going down in your family like that? Think about the consequences of this lousy decision, right? Like we don't have slaves living in our house today, hopefully, none of you, but imagine if you had a servant or somebody that worked in your house, something in today's context, and you decided that, I've got a good idea. Maybe this servant that works in our house should sleep with my spouse so that we can have children. Anybody see anything wrong with that? Like, does that seem like that could have some negative repercussions to it? Right? Well, it did. It did. It would today in our life, and it did back then in their life. And it wasn't just minor consequences. It wasn't just a little bit of chaos. It caused chaos in the household. It caused chaos in the community. And then ultimately, it caused chaos for generations and centuries to come. In other words, that chaos that was ensued by that one lousy decision, by them taking control, we are still facing the consequences of that decision today. Imagine making a decision that affects people a few thousand years later, that they're still dealing with your bad decision. Right? Let me tell you how it played out. Here's why it was a bad decision. Because God eventually answered his prayer, or delivered on his promise, I should say. He eventually delivered on his promise. It shouldn't be a surprise, he always does, but he eventually did. And so here's what happened. Abraham and Sarah eventually had a son. They did. The only problem there is now Abraham had two sons. Right? So he had a son with Hagar, the servant, and he had a son with his wife Sarah, the blessed, promised son that they were expecting. So now there were two sons. And when you fast forward this story a little bit, here's how those two downlines played out. The first son, Ishmael, the son of Hagar, from Ishmael, we get the Palestinians. You might be familiar with them if you watch the news today. We get the Palestinian nation. And out of the Palestinian nation, what we see is the rise of a person by the name of Muhammad. And out of Muhammad, what we find is the Nation of Islam and the Muslim religion. Interesting, huh? Now, let's look at the other downline, Isaac. Out of Isaac, we find the Jewish people. And from the Jewish people, who do we get? We get Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. And from there, we get the religion Christianity. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to look at the world today and find two more opposing viewpoints than the Muslim religion and the Christian religion, right? They are at odds to this very day, all because of this one bad decision, taking control when it should have been left up to God. Now, there is one more massive, massive spiritual lesson to be had out of this text here, and that is don't ever sleep with a girl named Hagar. Just kidding. Now look, I want you guys to think of a time, I want you to sort of think of a time when you tried to take control. Think of something that was going on in your life where you thought, you know what, I know what the Bible says, I know what God says, but I'm going to take control. I'm going to do it my way instead. You know, maybe for you, maybe it's somebody sitting here today and it's your dating life, right? You know what the Bible says, this whole equally yoked thing, right? Like I should probably be with somebody that has similar beliefs to me, that is also a believer, that believes in the same God, that's also a Christian, right? We're going in the same direction. But there's probably people here that are saying, I know, but I can change him, right? I can change her, right? And we convince ourselves of that, even though it's not biblical. It's not what we're told by God. Maybe it's not your dating life. Maybe it's your financial life, right? We look at the text, we look at the Bible, we know what God's instructions are for our life financially. This whole thing about I'm supposed to give my first and best back to God, right? I'm supposed to tithe, I'm supposed to give 10% back, first and best, right? But surely those words weren't written for me, right? What does God know about my financial situation, right? I'm probably much better at handling my finances than God. Right? Sometimes we think that. Why would I want to follow those instructions? They just came from God. Right? Maybe it's at work for you today. Maybe you struggle to delegate. You struggle to give things up at work. And so as a result of struggling, because nobody else can do it as good as you, right? So what do? You show up early, you leave late, you bear the burden, right? You own all the stress, all the anxiety, all the pressure. Everything resides right up here on your shoulders because you have to be in control of all of it. Maybe for somebody here today, I don't know if we have any of these in our church, but you've heard of helicopter parents, right? These parents that sort of hover over their kids, right? I know you know what I'm talking about, right? They hover over everything that their kid is doing. They got to hover over the top of it. Kid doesn't get their assignment done, like the project is due tomorrow, they've had 90 days to get it done, and it's the night before, 11 o'clock at night, project's not done, so what does mom do? She stays up late and helps them get it done, right? I can't have my kid get a bad grade, so I'm going to stay up late, I'm going to make sure it gets done. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and send my kid to bed. I don't want them to be tired when they present their project that I did for them, right? We're hovering. We're hovering over the top. We're taking control of everything. Maybe you're the parent that you can't stand the thought of your child leaving their house today with their outfit that doesn't match, their hair isn't combed, right? Because you have thoroughly convinced yourself if that were to happen, your child probably would not get into college and would certainly end up homeless, right? All because of that one decision. And that's sometimes where we're at, right? That's sometimes how we look at things when we're trying to take control. I mean, I've seen helicopter parents, they're so bad sometimes, it's like, I'm going to send my kid out to check the mail, but first I got to put a helmet on them and some D-pads. Got to make sure they're okay getting to the mailboxes back, right? Hover, hover, hover. Sometimes we got to give it up. Let's do a little exercise this morning. If you have a pen, if you have your outline, a piece of paper, whatever, I want you to write something down this morning. I want you to write down one area of your life that you are trying to control right now. Just something that you are trying to control. Write something down, whatever it is. Maybe it's your little kids, like we've been talking about. Maybe you're trying to control them. Maybe you have grown-up kids, right? Those kids, they've already left the house, but you're still trying to control every move that they make, right? Maybe today you're trying to control your spouse. That always works well, right? I'm trying to control my spouse. Or is it your coworkers, right? Maybe you're in an office where there's people in cubes next to you or offices next to you, and I'm trying to control everything about them. I don't like the way they dress. I don't like what they say. I don't like how they work. They do it differently than I do. I've got to control. Perhaps it's just your image. Are you trying to control your image, right? If you have an image to uphold, I got to control my image. Sometimes I need to just choose to surrender and trust God rather than try to control all of these different things. So I want you to look at whatever it was that you wrote down, and you need to look at it and say, is this one of these things that I need to give up? Is this one of these things that I need to surrender to God and see what He does with it? Now, while you've got your outline out, if you're a note taker, there's going to be three questions that we're going to go through here. And these three questions, I want you to ask yourself over and over and over as you are trying to make life decisions on what to control and what not to control. So when you look at these questions, as you look at all the different circumstances in your life, just stop for a moment, just pause for a moment and try to decide, is this something that I need to be controlling? Question number one on your outline is this: is it worth my concern? Is it even worth my concern? Now, what I'm really getting at here is, guys, does it matter? Does it matter? Like 5 years from today, will it even matter? Right? Like if I came to your house today and I opened up your linen closet, would all of your towels be perfectly folded, color coordinated, perfectly stacked, everything in its place, neat and tidy, right? Because you can't stand the idea of it not being under control, right? Are you the type of person that maybe you can't stand somebody eating or drinking in your car, right? Are you that person, like, nobody eats in your car, nobody drinks in your car, nobody leaves food in your car? I'll admit it, I'm guilty. I know, I see my wife's like nudging my kid. I know, that's me, right? I'm guilty of that one. But here's the thing, guys, does it matter? Does it really, in the grand scheme of things, matter at all? Because if it doesn't, here's what happens. When you are trying to oversee your kids and your this and your that and your towels and your car and all this stuff, what happens is you start to drive yourself crazy. You drive yourself a little bit trying to be in control of all of it. But you know who else you drive crazy? Everybody around you. You drive everybody around you nuts because you're trying to control everything. So just ask yourself, is it worth it? Right? Is it even worth my concern? Now, number two is it mine to control? Is it even yours to control? It's a good question. And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes, how many of you realize that there are things that God actually wants you to take an action step? Sometimes when we pray and we ask God to help us out in different areas, it's not always just a matter of relinquishing it, right? Just because we give it up to God, we don't just get to relinquish our responsibility. They're not sort of the same. They're not one and the same. Surrendering to God is not exactly the same as relinquishing our responsibility. Sometimes we have to still take an action step that's required in order to do what needs to be done. So if I'm living tight financially, maybe I'm living paycheck to paycheck and I'm barely making ends meet, there may be an action step that's required. I might have to figure out how to spend less, right? That might be an action step. I may have to eat out less. I may have to put less things on my credit card. Stop buying things to impress people that you don't really like and buying things that you don't really need, right? That may be an action step that you have to take. If your marriage is struggling today, if that's where you're at, and my marriage is tight, and my marriage is struggling, first thing I'd ask you to do is examine your own heart. Start with you. Look internally here and see, is it you? Pray. Ask God to help you. And then examine your own heart. Because the action step might be that you need to forgive. You might have to let something go. You might have to forgive somebody. You might have to seek out Christian marriage counseling, perhaps for both of you. You might have to join a marriage life group or something at the church, right? So there may be an action step required. If you're a young person here today, maybe you're not married, and you're thinking, well, am I ever going to get married? Am I ever going to find that right person, that right somebody? Do they even exist? And I think the answer probably is yes. They're out there somewhere, but you may have to take an action step. You might have to move out of your parents' basement, get a job, comb your hair, stop playing Pokemon Go all day, right? There may be an action step that's required for you to do this. Now, if it's not for you to concern, or if it's not for you to control, you've made the determination, this is not one for me to control, then you move on to your third question. And this is a big, this one I think is really important. Is it for God alone? Is it for God alone? There are some things, guys, in our lives where it is truly for God alone. It is to give up to God. It is only for God, because only God can handle the situation. And so you've got to look at it and assess that. And in fact, in Philippians chapter 4, it says this. And these words were written by the Apostle Paul. And interesting that he chose this time and place to write these words. But if you could imagine, Paul was in prison. He was literally chained to a prison guard on house arrest. And he thought, well, this is a good time to write. And so he decided to write these words. And here's what he says. Do not be anxious about anything. Right? Do not be anxious about anything. Let's just start there. Do not be anxious about anything. Well, how many of you were anxious about something this week? Right? I know I was, right? I was anxious about something this week. Some of you are probably sitting here anxious about something today. Like, is this sermon ever going to end? Right? You're anxious, right? Anxious, right? So do not be anxious about anything. But, then he goes on to say, but in every situation. Now, what is every situation? That to me sounds like all situations, right? So, in my finances, in my marriage, dealing with my kids, dealing with my work, all areas, right? So do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. Now, why would prayer and petition give thanksgiving? Well, because I think what he's trying to tell us here is that God answers prayers. So I'm going to be thankful. So I'm going to pray on everything. I'm going to make my case to God on everything. I'm going to pray on everything. I'm not going to be anxious about it. I'm going to give it up to God. And I'm going to be thankful because I know that God's listening. He's always listening. He already knows what I want and need before I ask, but he's always listening. Now here's the cool part. It says, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So what does that mean? Here's what it means. What he's telling us is that when we give it up to God, when it's something in our life that we just hand over to God and we trust in God and we're not anxious about it and we're thankful in our prayers, here's what God does for us. He gives us a supernatural peace. I like the sound of it. A supernatural peace, a supernatural calming that overtakes us. Have anybody ever been going through a situation in your life where it was a really difficult struggle, but nobody around you knew that you were even going through it? Because you had handed it off to God, and you prayed on it, and you had a calming, you had supernatural peace. I think that's what he's talking about here, right? That's what he's getting at. And I shared this story with some of you before, and I'm gonna paraphrase a little bit of it and shorten it for your benefit. My wife and I, a few years ago, we went bankrupt. It was a difficult financial time for us, and we were struggling, and we had a series of foreclosures. We lost our homes, we lost our cars, we sort of lost everything, and had to start over. And in the midst of all of this, we were blessed, and God provided a home for us. And if you're going through foreclosures and bankruptcies and stuff, it's not easy to get a home. But God provided a home that we were able to buy through a contract for deed. And a couple years into the contract for deed, typically what happens is you go out and you get your own home loan and you secure this on your own. Well, when you're dealing with foreclosures and bankruptcies and this, that, and the other, it's hard to do that. So what happened was my boss stepped up and he offered to put his signature on the paperwork for me. In other words, he co-signed the note. How cool is that, right? He's a tremendous person, and it was a tremendous blessing, and he's very generous. But he offered to co-sign the note for us. Now, that was great, but here's something that happens. The way they constructed this, every 12 months, in fact, it's this very month that it's going on, every 12 months, they reassess the whole thing. We have to redo all the paperwork. We supply all our banking stuff, we re-sign all the paperwork. It's quite a process. And every 12 months we go through this, and the idea is that at some point, we will be able to take over the note by ourselves, and he'll be able to come off the note. Well, only 3 years into this process, we haven't been able to do that. So here's what happens. There's about a 30-day window where, theoretically, we could be out of our house, right? What if I walk in one day, and the paperwork's sitting in front of my boss, and he says, I don't think I'm going to sign it this year. Right? Now, fortunately, he hasn't done that. I tell my wife that if he ever does that, it's probably a pretty good indication that I'm about to be fired. But he hasn't done that yet. In fact, every year he's generously continued to sign it. And hopefully he will until we're able to do it all on our own. But here's the reality of it, guys. I don't stress about it. I don't lose an ounce of sleep about it. Had I not shared it with you, none of you would have even known about it. I'm not anxious. I'm not worried. I'm not concerned. I don't fret 1 ounce about it. And here's why. I gave it up to God. I said, this one's yours, God. Because here's the deal. God put me in the house to begin with. God gave me the job directly across the street from my house, like 50 feet away from my house. God gave me the boss who signed the note. And so there's really nothing in this equation that I get to control, right? Nothing I can do that changes the circumstances. So I just give it up to God. And I pray to God, and I said, this one's yours. And I hand it off. And here's what I found, guys. This will hold true over and over, but here's what I found. Is that when you try to control every aspect of your life, it will lead to nothing but anxiety, stress, frustration. But when you just give it up to God and you hand it over to God, it will lead to this supernatural calming. You will experience God's peace. So 3 things you're going to ask yourself. You're going to ask yourself, is it worth my concern? Is it worth my concern at all? Does it really matter? Is it mine to control? If there is, there may be an action step. Is it for God alone? Is this an area that I just need to hand over to God? And once you've asked those questions, you're to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways submit to God, and He will make your path straight.